Black Sabbath's Technical Ecstasy, the next album in their discography, was going to be the one that was going to finally be the radical turn. The one in which would semi-define where the remainder of the 1970s was going to go for the band, and ultimately prove to be the demise of one of their members. Technical Ecstasy is an album that is a departure from what Black Sabbath had done previously, something that they had not necessarily been shy in making known that this was probably coming, with the previous album, Sabotage, which kind of showed that the synthy, a little bit more rock and roll style album was certainly coming. Technical Ecstasy embraced this completely. The doomy forefathers of metal had almost transformed into a rock and roll band, very similar to Deep Purple on this album. And it was something that became very, very apparent with some of the tracks, such as Gypsy. And it was something that became all too apparent in the sessions and in the turmoil that the band itself was starting to undergo, with Ozzy Osbourne's rampant addictions, with internal turmoil throughout the band members, and also in the fact that Ozzy Osbourne opted to depart for a short time after the release of this record, only to come back for the following record, Never Say Die. This album could be considered one of the very first failures in Black Sabbath's discography, but certainly not one of the last. In fact, this is an album that, for many people, just seemed like a very low par, very poor effort simply because it didn't resemble the albums that came previous to it. It's almost, in modern day levels, this would almost be like a band such as Metallica going off and making an album such as Load or Reload that a lot of people didn't like, but at the same time others enjoyed because of the direction shift. Something that maybe has a little bit of a period of accessibility to another generation of audiences, while at the same time the band themselves was just doing something that they really wanted to do. The end result, however, is an album that really isn't all that bad, I have to admit. From listening to this record, if you take a look at it as a rock and roll record, if you don't look at it so much as a real attempt at being a heavy metal record, Technical Ecstasy is actually not that poor of a release. It's got a lot of good grooves, it has good songwriting, and it feels a little forced, though, especially on Ozzy's part. Ozzy's part feels a little bit forced here, and it almost seems as though they went for a little bit of diversity that was maybe not 100% on his terms, so to speak, but it was something that they all opted to do. This is also an album that is marred by, I'm thinking, just a lot of negative reinforcement due to the stylistic shift. And because of that, a lot of people find Technical Ecstasy to be kind of the beginning of the end for this particular era of Black Sabbath. The album itself, as a whole, as an 8-track whole, is passable. In fact, it's slightly above average, so to speak. But that's mainly because I'm looking at it as a rock and roll record. I'm looking at it in the same vein as a Deep Purple record, as I mentioned previously. And Deep Purple has always had that, seminal charm to it, that had kind of like a little bit of a bluesy element to it, as well as the rock and roll, as well as the harder edge, and as well as the synths and the experimentation, something that Deep Purple has always made their staple. That wasn't Black Sabbath's staple. However, Black Sabbath pulled the trick fairly well. There are a couple songs on here that are instant classics. There's also a couple others that are just bona fide cheese fests. And whenever you are able to easily pick out which ones are the good and which ones are the bad, whenever you listen to them, that's whenever things become a little bit, less than perfect. That's whenever you start to realize this is an album that's perhaps mired by a little bit of weak material or some poor decision making. This is an album that's dedicated and principally speaking about prostitutes, about drugs, rock and roll doctors, probably the best example of that, and just about a life of depravity, so to speak. There's a lot of songs in here about women, not just prostitutes, and it just seems that the dark direction that Black Sabbath had pre-established prior to all of this had been completely and totally abandoned. And that gave the fans, I think, a deep feeling of resentment and abandonment as well. Almost as if to say, well, we've crafted this whole culture for you guys. You guys embrace this culture that we have crafted. We no longer need this culture that we have crafted. We no longer need you. Something that a lot of people, I think, probably believed whenever this album was released in 1976. Overall, though, whenever you listen to it, it's just a stylistic shift that the band was able to pull off quite nicely on this album. However, it's one that's going to be oft-times considered to be not a real Black Sabbath record, so to speak. It's going to be one that a lot of people will kind of label under that negative guys, that bad album territory. However, as I've said throughout this entire video, if you listen to this record, if you examine this record, and if you really just believe this record as a rock and roll record, as a hard rock record, it isn't terrible. The cover is unique. It's apparently two robots having sex on an elevator or something, but I don't know. I don't understand what the concept was on that. I don't know really what they were thinking. I always kind of thought the cover was a little, strange. Not just because of the concept, but just because of the execution. It's one of those covers where you kind of know what's going on, but you don't know what's going on. However, Technical Ecstasy did signal one thing. It signaled that that old classic sound was, well, going away. It also means that the turmoil in the band was also really reaching a crest, reaching ahead. And moving ahead, the band was going to have to deal with even more problems, even more turmoil, and deal with the egos and the massive, massive problems of a couple of members specifically. But we'll get to that next time on the Black Sabbath Discography Review here with the Cover Killer Nation.